Hi, I'm Len Rydell, the Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to welcome you to another lecture in the Death of the Army of Tennessee series, which was recorded by Blue and Gray in October 1995 in Nashville. Our speaker in this symposium has long ago passed away, and for years and years, his signature work in Deadly Earnest, the history of the 1st Missouri Brigade, had been out of print, and it came back in print recently and is in print now. It was that book that I had happened to stumble on. It had just come out, and it was a wonderful, wonderful book, very readable and outstanding narrative, and it followed the 1st Missouri Brigade and its primary commander, John Bowen, throughout the Civil War. And of course, the 1st Missouri ended up in the Tennessee Campaign. They were also at Port Gibson in the Vicksburg Campaign and elsewhere. And so focusing on a regimental history such as the 1st Missouri was something that I thought would be a good addition to help people focus on how combat impacted individuals, because it was individuals that were killed and wounded and maimed. It were communities that were destroyed forever. It was people who worked together, who did what they had to do. And so when you had an opportunity to inject this into the program, as I wanted to do, since we'd already focused on Claiborne and Nathan Bedford Forrest, I thought this would be a nice addition as well. And so I put Phil in. Now, Phil at the time was a newspaper reporter in the state capital, Missouri, and he was a very well-regarded reporter and writer. He spoke well and still does speak well. He was a compulsive researcher. He reminds me a lot, and it's an unfair comparison, but if any of you have read any of Douglas Southall Freeman's works, whether it's R.E. Lee or Lee's Lieutenants or the George Washington biography, you see this compulsive nature of digging out materials and so forth. And Phil does this. He does a marvelous job in assembling the history of a brigade in the state that he's living in. So he's right there at the state archives in Columbia and elsewhere, and he was able to dig out just a marvelous set. And I'm in Deadly Earnest, the name of the book. I'm in Deadly Earnest. You ought to read the book. You'll find it intensely interesting and very informative. When Phil joined us, he hadn't had a whole lot of opportunity to speak about his book. You know, it was relatively new out, and I think he was flattered that he was invited. Coming out of Missouri, he had difficulties with plane connections, and so he arrived late in the program, arrived during the aforementioned dinner that I talked about in the overall assembly, once I got to know him and talk to him, I just found him delightful. And you'll have another opportunity or two in this series to hear him speak before his untimely death. And I am just delighted that you have the opportunity to experience the man who wrote the book, who has written about the experience of the 1st Missouri Brigade in the 1864 Tennessee Campaign. Sit back, relax, and enjoy Phil Gottschalk. Hi, I'm Len Rydell, Executive Director of the Blue and Gray Education Society, and I'd like to welcome you to the final lecture of the 8 that we presented in the Death of the Army of Tennessee series, which we conducted and presented in October of 1995. In Nashville, Tennessee. Wiley Sword I've already introduced in his earlier discussion, and the kudos that I gave to his narrative writing of this campaign in Embrace an Angry Wind. And this is the second part of that book, what happens after Franklin and the death of the Army at Nashville, and then some general elements of the retreat. It's a sobering book because the death that took place in the dark, and so much of the Battle of Franklin was fought after the sun had gone down. They were short days without daylight savings or standard time on November 30th, moving towards the winter solstice just 3 weeks later. And so the vicious fighting that took place in the twilight, the attack started somewhere around 4 o'clock or so, and then carried on into the night hours before it sputtered out, and it was vicious and terrible, and the Army suffered terribly, only to be carried forward to high ground surrounding Nashville, where Hood tried to entice Thomas to make a mistake in attacking him. Thomas didn't make a mistake. He did attack him, and in 2 days, Hood's army was swept off the hill and swept out of Tennessee and retreated. And so this lecture from Wiley reflects the end of this campaign that started with such high promise. I mean, as I've said before, Hood should have captured Schofield and destroyed Schofield's forces at Spring Hill, and he didn't. And that was a tragic opportunity lost that probably would have ensured that there'd have been no Battle of Franklin and been no Battle of Nashville. Although, having done that, no doubt Hood would have continued on into Kentucky, and who knows what would have happened. Certainly Thomas probably would have been compelled to chase him, and or Grant would have been compelled in the wintertime to detach further troops from to Cincinnati to repulse Hood's adventures. So Hood coulda, woulda, shoulda. Of course, we just don't know. But this finishes this series, and I hope you've enjoyed it. I appreciate your joining us, and please sit back, relax, and enjoy Wiley Sword's talk on the final death of the Army of Tennessee. Okay, Karen, that finishes for.
A lot of people know that, but a lot of people don't know that Missouri sent at least 40,000 men into the Confederate Army. Now, numbers are easy to throw around. In my book, I cite my references throughout the book, but the figures that I've just given you came from the official report to Congress of the War Department, I think in 1909 or whatever it was. But that's a lot of men. General Dabney Mowry, who was a Virginian, who served with Lee's army, who had seen troops from every state in the Confederacy, had this to say about the Missouri Brigade. He called them the magnificent Missouri Brigade, the finest body of troops I had ever seen, which is rather high praise from a man who later became the founder of the Southern Historical Society, among other things. We paid a price, a partial list in a book by a man named Leslie Anders, a professor from Warrensburg, called Missouri's Confederate Roll of Honor, lists the names of 6,500 Missourians who died fighting for the South. Ed Bars, whom you had the great fortune to be on a battlefield tour with, and whom I consider anyway the foremost authority on the war in total, and who did write the preface to my book, which I was very grateful for, and who did correct all the mistakes I made in it, hopefully all of them, before I made the final draft. Ed Bars has this to say about the Missouri Brigade. He said, and this is a quote from Ed, "Few, if any units north or south saw as much action as the Missouri Brigade. Their combat record is more distinguished than that of the better publicized Stonewall Brigade and the Iron Brigade, the Union Iron Brigade. Counting their battles as members of the Missouri State Guard, these Missourians fought 13 battles, 6 engagements, numerous skirmishes, and 6 sieges. When I gave this talk in Missouri one time, I said, yet the Boone County Library, where I live, contains 3 books on Jennison's Jayhawkers, 2 books on the Union 18th Missouri Regiment, and none at all on the Missouri Brigade. Well, it does not. It does not. In fact, I've got them on numbers. We've got 10 books on the Missouri Brigade there now. Kentucky is usually thought of as a southern state, and they make quite a to-do about it, especially during racetrack time. Kentucky was also a divided state, sent about 76,000 men into the Federal Army, fewer than Missouri did. Missouri sent 109. And Kentucky sent about 25,000 men into the Confederate Army. Missouri sent almost twice as many. And yet you never hear much about Missouri. You hear about Kentucky, and especially about the Orphan Brigade. Those numbers I gave you are from Historical Times Illustrated encyclopedias. Well, why were these Missourians fighting for the South? Let's take a look at a picture of one of them. This picture is the Dunlap brothers, Private Samuel B. Dunlap and Private Robert Dunlap. This was Robert here, who lost an arm, not an arm, but his hand there at Kennesaw Mountain. These are a couple of young boys from St. Joe, Missouri, who served in the Missouri State Guard and then in the Missouri Brigade from April 1861 to June 1865. In other words, they made the whole trip. The members of the Missouri Brigade fought in Missouri, of course, and in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Georgia, and Alabama. That's a pretty good trip. Their families back in Missouri were under martial law. The state of Missouri, the entire state of Missouri, was under martial law from 1861 to 1865. And martial law in Missouri meant arbitrary arrests, confiscation of property, arson, torture, murder, banishment from the state. At one time, the Federals ordered the evacuation of 3 counties along the western border of Missouri. And so Missourians had reason, some of them did, many of them did, 40,000 of them did, to fight for the South. And in November 1861, their legislature, which had been forced out of the state capitol because it had been occupied by Union troops, passed the Secession Act. They were admitted to the Confederate States of America and became the 12th star in the flag, Kentucky being the 13th. What do they look like? In general, their appearance, character, and background were typical of all Confederate State soldiers. Most of them were young farm boys, 18 to 30. The largest group were 18-year-olds, but there were some 15-year-olds and a few 50-year-olds. About 20% of them were illiterate, but thank God for historians, there were a few college graduates and some very literate and educated men, and thank God for them, because they could read and write, and they wrote in their letters and diaries many, many things. They had a distinct physical appearance, most of the Missourians did. One other Southern Confederate described them as being rough-looking and a damn hard-looking bunch. Others wrote that the Missouri soldiers appeared more intelligent and finer-looking as a whole than men from some other states further south. That's an opinion, of course. The Missouri Brigade was not filled with angels by any manner of means. It had its fair share of drunks and thieves and some deserters and some cowards, some stragglers, some men with criminal records, and some misfits, and some alcoholics, and so forth and so on. But in general, they were high-quality men, and a great many of them came from the part of Missouri where I now live, Columbia, Missouri, which is the center of the state, halfway between St. Louis and Kansas City. In fact, the SCD chapter that I belong to is called the Little Dixie chapter. It's named after that section of the state. That section of Missouri is called Little Dixie. Little Dixie because it was settled primarily by folks from Virginia and Kentucky. Well, by the time they got to Franklin, they looked pretty gaunt. And they were best described by a very famous author, which you're going to have an opportunity to hear pretty soon. Wiley Sword said that they looked like they had been starved as they stood in tattered ranks with their bayonet sticks on their imported Enfields. Their uniforms were threadbare and worn. Many were wearing captured federal clothing. Some had no coats or shoes. And in their haversacks, if they had any, they carried mostly sugar cane or hickory nuts or parched corn. And they were mostly ragged and dirty, and they looked more like a band of robbers than anything else. But as we will hear, they did a pretty good job for the South at Franklin. I want to backtrack just a little bit, tell you a little bit about the Missouri State Guard, because it played a very important role in the Missourians' experience. This Missouri State Guard was a state army. It was not a Confederate. In 1860, taking heavy casualties meant that you were in the forefront of the fight. And the Missourians set a lot of records in that regard, which I'm sure that they would have been glad not to have set. Well, after Wilson's Creek in September of 1861, they besieged 3,600 Federals at Lexington, Missouri, which is on the Missouri River, about 50 miles east of Kansas City. And the Missouri State Guard had grown to about 18,000 men by that time. And they defeated the Federals, and that was the largest capture of Federal forces in the war up to that time, which was very well publicized, both north and south. It really wasn't too good an idea in a way. As far as Sterling Price was concerned, he was the commander of the Missouri State Guard and became a very popular man. Took a train ride back to Richmond to meet with President Davis, and on the way back, everywhere the train stopped, people greeted him and applauded him and so forth, and there were people saying, hey, maybe Sterling Price ought to be president of the Confederacy instead of Jeff Davis. People did say that. I don't think it would have been a good idea at all, but Jeff Davis was not totally enamored of Sterling Price. Sort of maybe the way Bob Dole looks at Newt Gingrich, I don't know. But at any rate, their next battle as members of the Missouri State Guard was at Pea Ridge, Arkansas, in which time about 2,300 men were still in the Missouri State Guard, but at this time about 3,000 had enlisted in Confederate service in the 1st Missouri Confederate Brigade at that time. And Pea Ridge, Arkansas, really, the historians that say that it was Wilson's Creek that kept Missouri and the Union are, in my opinion, totally wrong, because Wilson's Creek was a big Federal defeat. The Federals withdrew from the Springfield area entirely. And in fact, they withdrew to the extent that Price was able to march all the way up the river at Lexington and recruit more men. But Pea Ridge was the battle, because there the Federals defeated Ben McCulloch, who was the Confederate commander at Pea Ridge. The Missourians, however, fought extremely well at Pea Ridge. In fact, McCulloch had a low opinion of the Missourians, said they weren't nothing but a bunch of rabble, and the Missourians did a much better job at Pea Ridge than the soldiers that McCulloch himself brought, the regular Confederate soldiers. Their next major battle the Missourians then, about 6,000 of them then, went across the river with General Price to enter Confederate service. And their next major battle was at Corinth, Mississippi in October of 1862. 7 Missouri regiments were there in Confederate service. And the Eastern papers took notice of them in their first great attack. And you aren't anywhere in the United States until the Eastern papers take notice of you. That's the same thing applies today. Nothing happens unless it happens in New York or Los Angeles, as the case may be. But this is one of the things that happened at Corinth, where the Missourians had 831 men killed and wounded. One Yankee newspaper, and unfortunately, I tried my damnedest to find out which one, because I got this quote that I'm going to read you from the scrapbook, and the guy it just says one Yankee newspaper. It doesn't say who. But anyway, it says this, and I'm going to read you this, because it might explain why my book is titled what it is. It says, "They are terribly in earnest, and will do all in their power on the side of treason. It is high time to throw aside the idea that Missouri rebels or those from any other state are to be put down with mild or conciliatory measures. When men march barefoot, mile after mile over rough and filthy roads, their feet exuding blood at every step, when their rations consist of a single ear of corn, and when their clothing hangs in rags about them, with their safety endangered by every gust of the wind, it is time to know that these men believe in the cause they have espoused. When men thus shod, fed, and clothed fight with a desperation unparalleled in history, as instanced by that terrific charge at our batteries at Corinth, it is time for us to understand that only an active and vigorous war will end the rebellion with honors to our cause. Usually when you read about Corinth, you read about the great valor of the Texans at Battery Robinette, and they were very, very valorous. But they did not make much of a breakthrough at Battery Robinette, although a few regiments did. Where the Missourians attacked at Battery Powell, they broke all the way through into town and were fighting around Rosecrans headquarters until they were evicted from town by a countercharge of another new group of federal troops. The next big factor in building the fighting reputation of the Missouri Brigade was at Champion Hill, Mississippi on May 16, 1863, when they made what Ed Bars has called one of the great counterattacks of the war at Champion Hill. He said that they attacked with a ferocity that astounded both Federal and Confederate commanders. And here's a good time for me to stop and say this. Throughout my book, when I used quotations, I tried to use as many quotations as possible that I could from, quote, quote, the enemy. In other words, my feeling is that what Yankees have to say about the fighting ability of rebels is a lot more credible than what rebels have to say about their own fighting ability, and vice versa. When you read rebel soldiers telling you how tough these Yankees were that they were fighting, you can believe they were tough, because they're not going to give them credit that they don't deserve. And I think that's a very important thing that I think good historians do. Not that I'm saying I'm a good one, but I do think that it's important that you get more credibility from what your opponent says and what you say yourself. Well, there's a lot of great stories about the great attack at Champion Hill, but I'll summarize it very briefly by quoting General S.D. Lee, who I'm sure you heard about the other day from Dr. Hathaway. General S.D. Lee was at Champion Hill, and he was an eyewitness to the charge of Bowen's division. Bowen's division consisted of the Missouri Confederate Brigade and a combined Missouri-Arkansas Brigade under Martin Green. This is what General S.D. Lee had to say, and I can't say it any better than General Lee. He said this about Champion Hill, Mississippi. The charge of this magnificent division for dash and gallantry was not surpassed by any troops on either side. They steadily advanced, firing as they advanced, and drove back Hovey's division, which had been reinforced by 2 regiments of Sanborn. And they later engaged and drove back the 2 brigades of Boomer and Holmes as they came up. In other words, Bowen drove back 2 complete divisions of Hovey and Crocker. And the charge and fighting was desperate and lasted nearly 2 hours. The Union troops were driven over a mile and beyond the crest of the hills that they had originally held and captured at Champion Hill. The Union troops made desperate stand on the slope of the hills towards the Champion House. In fact, the Missouri spearhead penetrated within 400 yards of federal headquarters at the Champion House. 16 guns of the 1st Missouri Battery, Union, and the 16th Ohio Battery and Dillon's Wisconsin Battery were placed in a ridge so that the 2 lines of battle could be seen. And this terrible artillery showered incessant shot and shell on the entire line of Bowen's Confederates. But even this did not drive these men back. That's what General S.D. Lee said about him. General S.D. Lee went from Missouri. General Hovey wasn't either. He was the federal commander. He said he called Champion Hill the Hill of Death. He said, I can't think of this bloody hill without sadness and pride. And he says, the loss of my division was nearly 1/3 of all the forces engaged. I never saw fighting like this. Well, so by the time the Vicksburg campaign was concluded, Champion Hill, as you all know, was the prelude to the siege of Vicksburg. By the time it was concluded, Bowen's hard-fighting Missouri and Arkansas troops were elite troops that had been sent wherever the threat was greatest in the siege of Vicksburg. Their losses reflected this. At Vicksburg, Bowen's division lost 31% of its men, or 758 soldiers. Forney's division lost 1,120 men, or 26% of its strength. Smith's division lost 468 men, or 12% of its strength, and Stevenson's division lost 688 men, or 10% of its strength. So, as Bars points out, the smallest division did the hardest fighting and took the greatest percentage loss of all the divisions that fought at Vicksburg. And that includes the Missouri Confederate Brigade under General, it was Colonel Cockrell then, because Bowen was commanding the division. Of the 11 rebel brigades at Vicksburg, the smallest was Cockrell's Missouri Brigade, but it had more casualties than any other brigade at Vicksburg, except for one, and that was Shute's Brigade. Colonel Cockrell reported, he said, this is a loss in killed and wounded, 113 killed and 446 wounded at Vicksburg, of over 1/3 of the whole brigade, and shows that this brigade was almost continuously exposed to the enemy's fire, and at no time did they falter. I might point out that if you know anything about Vicksburg, you know that there were 2 major assaults, May 19th and May 22nd, both of them at Stockade Redan, and the one on May 22nd was at other points along the Vicksburg line, at other points. But on May 19th, only Stockade Redan was attacked. I imagine you can guess who was defending Stockade Redan. If you guess, you got it right. And you go there and you'll find it in the marker inside of Stockade Redan. As a matter of fact, the Missouri Monument on the Vicksburg battlefield is right near Stockade Redan, and I'm quite proud of that Missouri Monument. It's the only monument I have ever seen on a battlefield that honors men from both sides. I know of no other monument that does that, because this was not the first, nor was it the last of many times that Missourians in blue fought Missourians in gray. Well, as you know how Vicksburg came out, And so the next time we encountered the Missourians was at Demopolis, Alabama, after Vicksburg in October 1863, and some measure of their reputation that they had so bloodily bought at Corinth and at Champion Hill and at Vicksburg and at other places may be judged by the remarks made by President Jefferson Davis as he stood before this brigade at Demopolis. And this is what the president said: "I look with sadness on your reduced ranks and feel it is a high honor to be in the presence of such chivalrous soldiers. I have heard of your heroism on the bloody fields of the West, and I must express to you the high regard which I cherish for your privations and positive sufferings in the cause of liberty. I thank you from the deepest recesses of my heart, from its very fiber, for your dauntless courage and untiring devotion to our common cause. May you live to see the flag of our infant republic floating proudly among the national colors of the world. When this vision of joy is ours, it will be in part due to your own brave hearts and stout arms." Pretty good praise, I'd say. At that same time, there was a colonel in the 20th Mississippi Regiment that was at a review of the troops at that time, and this is what he said about it. This is a Mississippi soldier, Lieutenant Colonel. He says, "The far-famed Missouri Brigade, they are the brag men of this or any other army. They fight better, drill better, and look better than any other men in our army. Clean clothes, clean faces, and all in uniform, and every man's step. General Cockrell commands him. He's a young man and very ordinary looking. I can't see anything in his looks that entitles him to the command of such men who passed in the finest order possible." Well, the enlistments were expiring. The 3-year enlistments were expiring. Though the Missouri Brigade en masse, almost en masse, re-enlisted for 40 years. For 40 years. And so on May 23rd, 1864, the Confederate Congress passed a resolution of thanks, which read, in part, resolved by the Congress of the Confederate States that the thanks of Congress are eminently due and hereby tendered to Brigadier General F.M. Cockrell and the officers and soldiers composing the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th Regiments of Missouri Infantry, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd Regiments of Missouri Cavalry, and the batteries of Bledsoe, Landis, Eber, Walsh, Dawson, and Barrett, and Woodson's detached company which served in Virginia, for the prompt renewal of their pledges of fidelity to the cause of Southern independence for 40 years, unless independence and peace shall be sooner secured. And now, I've got to digress here just a moment, Mr. Riddell. The only Missourians that ever fought in Virginia fought alongside a Virginia outfit, and they were at the Battle of New Market, Virginia. And there was a small group of them, it was just a company called Woodson's Company. You look up and see who took the heaviest casualties in New Market, Virginia. Look it up. Because there weren't many of them, but they fought just like all the rest of the Missourians did everywhere else. Well, of course, in the Atlanta campaign, their major action in the Atlanta campaign was repelling the charge at Kennesaw Mountain, where the Federals lost, attacking Cockrell. They lost 560 men at Kennesaw. To summarize the Atlanta campaign, the casualties in the Atlanta campaign, the Missouri Brigade lost 451 men, which was 74 killed and 377 wounded, fighting as a part of General Sam French's division. About 1,630 of Missourians had marched from that parole camp in Demopolis on May 11th to join the Army of Tennessee. And before the Atlanta campaign was over, they had lost over a third of their number. And although some of the wounded might later return to duty and did, it now contained, after Atlanta, about 1,100 men, which was slightly more than half of its strength when it was paroled at Vicksburg. Lieutenant Warren is a man whose diary I was fortunate enough to find. And Lieutenant Warren was a highly educated man. He was from Richmond, Virginia, incidentally. On September 15th, he wrote a letter, 1864, he wrote a letter to his brother that probably mirrored the sentiments of most Missourians after Atlanta fell. I'm not going to read all of it to you, but I'm going to read to you that says, he's talking about the Battle of Jonesboro, south of Atlanta, and says, we remain to hold the works in Atlanta. Had we been sent to the assistance of Hardee at Jonesboro sooner, we might have had a glorious victory. Then he said these significant words to me, significant. There is great dissatisfaction in the Army in regard to General Hood, especially in Lee's Corps. It is observable to the humblest private that the Army is not being handled as General Johnson handled it. I believe that he, Johnson, could see just a month further ahead than Hood. At any rate, we would be 15,000 men better off and an immense amount of property. Now, that's important to me for this reason. A lot of historians say, well, all that talk about Hood, Johnson, and so forth, that was all came after the war. That was all reminiscences. The guys were rehashing it and so forth and so on. And many of the accounts that you read, that is true. But when you read a letter, that's written September 15, 1864, this guy did not have the benefit of all that. He's telling it like it really was. When Lieutenant Warren wrote this letter, he couldn't know that within 23 days, the Missouri Brigade would be engaged in a very deadly battle, which was really the first real battle under Hood's command after the fall of Atlanta, and of course, it was at Allatoona, Georgia, October 5th, 1864. The commander of the federal forces at Franklin, the battle commander of the federal forces at Franklin, was a man named General Cox, Jacob Dolson Cox. Jacob Dolson Cox wrote a famous book, two of them, as a matter of fact, one called Atlanta and Nashville, and the other called The Battle of Franklin. And this is what he wrote about Allatoona. This is a federal general speaking. Looking to the numbers engaged, this was no doubt one of the most desperately contested actions of the war. The 39th Iowa suffered 170 casualties out of 280 men in action. The federal commander reported the federal losses 142 killed and 352 wounded and 212 missing, which represents 33% of the total federal force at Allatoona fighting from fortifications. A Confederate participant, Major D.W. Sanders, said, sharp, quick, and fatal was this ghastly combat. He was an eyewitness, and he wrote this. The assaulting brigades sustained heavy losses, both in officers and men. Cockrell, with his famous Missouri Brigade, led the charge on the west side of the mountain, passing over a large distance of abatis under a withering fire of muskets and artillery, ascended the mountain slope, and with a grand rush carried the outer line and one redoubt. Young, in command of Ector's Brigade of Texans, formed a part of this column. They were supporting Cockrell, and gallantly side by side with Cockrell's men planted their colors in the outer works of the enemy. The struggle in a hand-to-hand conflict raged with a fierceness and desperation that defies description. At Allatoona, the Missouri Brigade lost 49 men killed and 200 wounded, which, as usual, was the most of any brigade that fought at Allatoona. So those are the kind of men that stood ready to deploy at Franklin. I believe Wiley Sword has told you most everything about Franklin in general, and maybe some about the Missouri Brigade. So I'm going to concentrate on the actions of the Missouri Brigade. And I want to ask you to refer in your notebook to a fine map from Mr. Sword's book, map 6, shows the deployment of troops at Franklin. It's in section 5 of your book. I believe that Wiley already has told you about the fortifications on the line. In fact, it was a fortified line. The fact that there were on that fortified line 38 cannon ready to fire on the attack. On 6 of these batteries there reported their ammunition expenditure, and 6 of those batteries fired 1,700 rounds. We don't know how many of the other 3 fired. And Cox summarized the defensive positions, and you know about the outpost line with Wagner and so forth. And you also know that, let's look at the next picture, please. I should have shown you this picture. This is sort of typical of many Confederate soldiers, and I suppose that a lot of Missourians said Franklin probably, this guy's probably better dressed than a lot of them, because some of them, their pants were worn off to their knees. Let's look at the next one then. This, of course, you've been there. This is not a Pizza Hut, folks. Men died there, a lot of them. That's the gym, and it's now the Pizza Hut parking lot. Next picture, of course, is the Carter House, and you've been there. And the fiercest fighting, as Mr. Sword told you, took place from the backyard of the Carter House to the vicinity of the Cotton Gin. And that's important because I'm going to deal with that in a moment. Now, let's go on to the next map. This is my own map of the deployment a little bit. This is Stewart's division here. Here's Cheatham's. And then, of course, they move up to battle position. But the important thing from the standpoint of the Missouri Brigade is 2 things. First of all, there's the Columbia Pike right there in the middle, and then there's this railroad. And this railroad is important. This is the entire alignment in attack formation before they finally advance. And of course, incidentally, some accounts say there wasn't any rebel cannon in Missouri, Franklin, but there was 12. There were 6 guns from Guy Boer's Missouri Battery, St. Louis outfit, and let's have the next map. Guy Boer placed his cannons in sections. Now, here's another. This is Hood's attack plan. I use the word plan in the loosest possible sense. Attack plan. Here's the Columbia Pike. And here's the railroad. Now you can see from the terrain that it's natural for people to drift to the left, and help them to drift from the left. Helping a lot to drift from the left is this enfilade fire from across the river and from this Fort Granger here. And this map from historical times is a very good map. Here's that outpost line that you've heard about. And here's Claiborne's division, and part of Claiborne's men are sweeping around the right side here of Conrad, and part of Brown's men are sweeping around the left side. But here's French's division, here's Walthall and Hill scoring, and they're all crowding towards the center being where the cotton gin is. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the deployment. This is before the actual attack. Can we see another next slide, please? This is a Troyan painting of the colonel in his flag, and I thought it was proper for me to use this painting because to me this could be Colonel Hugh Garland of the 1st and 4th Missouri, who led his men on foot and was killed at Franklin. And his sword was captured there, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But that's why I used that picture. When the deployment was underway, a soldier in the Missouri Brigade, impressed with the scene, quoted Nelson's famous order at Trafalgar, "England expects every man to do his duty." Well, there's lots of Irishmen in the Missouri Brigade, a lot of them. A lot of them were members of volunteer fire companies from St. Louis, Missouri. And one of them, famous one was a wit named a guy named Denny Callahan. And when he heard this remark about England expects every man to do his duty, Callahan said, "This damn little duty England will get out of this Irish crowd." And everybody there laughed heartily, and Joseph Boyce, who's a member of the 1st Missouri, said, "The laugh that he raised was long and hearty, and it's possible to laugh in the face of death because 4 years of war hardens men." S.C. Trigg of the 3rd Missouri recalls that the brigade band played during the deployment, and that while waiting for the other brigades to deploy, Colonel Elijah Gates conducted a brigade drill while waiting for the advance to begin, because there was a nice smooth field between us and the enemy's works. Sears' brigade at the time of the deployment was ahead of Cockrell's brigade. But when they moved to the attack position, my Cockrell moved ahead of Sears. William Cavanaugh, incidentally, Gates said to his men, he says, "Boys, look to your front. We won't get a smell in this fight." Well, they got a lot more than a smell. William Cavanaugh remembered that the Missouri Brigade occupied very nearly the center of the line. He means the entire Confederate line. And he says, by the time we got within 500 or 600 yards of their works, we began to lose heavy. Their artillery from the parapets, there were 38 cannon there, would tear great holes through our ranks with shot, shell, and canister. But immediately, and just like clockwork, these gaps would close up, and we pressed forward, reserving our fire until we closed with the enemy. Captain Boyce described how the brigade's small brass band went up with us, starting out playing the Bonnie Blue Flag and changing to Dixie as we reached the deadly point. You know where the deadly point was. He said, I know it was an unusual thing for the tooters to go up with the shooters. So he gave the names of the men in the band who went advanced with the brigade right up to the parapet. That account was corroborated by a man named Charles St. Clair, a Virginia-born farmer from Missouri, who said, "I do know that Cockrell's brigade did go into battle with Franklin with a band playing." And then he said, "Cockrell's brigade generally went as far as any troops there." You have heard the description of Levi Schofield, the Federal standing in the works near the cotton gin, which said it was a grand sight which would make a lifelong impression on any man who saw such a well-conducted charge. And for a moment we were spellbound with admiration. But we knew as soon as they reached the firing distance that all that orderly grandeur would be changed to bleeding, writhing confusion. General Cockrell survived the war. He was wounded 5 times, but he survived the war, and incidentally, he survived the war and became United States Senator from Missouri for 30 years. General Cockrell told his son, Ewing Cockrell, that when he was given the order to charge those breastworks, he knew that the advance had to be over a long, flat plain before they reached there. And his son said, Father said he told his men, I'll lead the charge. And he told me he never expected to come out of it alive. And he also said that that order had come from General Joe Johnson, I wouldn't disobey it. He would have understood. But Hood had just come into command. In the first place, Joe Johnson would never given such a stupid order. And in the second place, he would have understood his subordinates who refused to obey such a suicidal order. Well, Cockrell rode in front of his men as they formed. And as they formed, Mexican War veteran Colonel Peter Floor and I, 2nd and 6th Missouri, was on the left. He was a university graduate and St. Louis lawyer. Colonel Hugh Garland, I showed you a picture that to me represents him, formed the 1st and 4th Missouri on the left center. See, the regiments consolidated after Vicksburg. The 24-year-old Irish St. Louis saddlemaker Pat Caniff aligned the 3rd and 5th Missouri on the right center, determined to make an excellent showing in his role as acting major commanding a regiment for the first time. And the 1st and 3rd Cavalry dismounted was commanded by Colonel Elijah Gates, a 32-year-old Northwest Missouri farmer. Well, they moved up, and Cockrell's horse was shot out from under him, and they got on another horse, and that horse was shot too. And Cockrell later recalled, I was shot twice in the right arm, and also through my left leg, and in my right ankle. When I got these wounds, I was at the front line in the midst of the fight. I tried my right leg, and when I found I couldn't walk on it, I hobbled off the field. Lieutenant Charles Cleveland was a Randolph County, Missouri clerk and farmer. He was elected lieutenant of Company I, the 1st and 3rd Cavalry. And he remembered what happened after Cockrell was disabled. Our men made a gallant charge led by Colonel Gates and Major Parker right up to the breastworks. Colonel Gates was on his horse riding up and down the line cheering his men when he was shot in one arm and a few minutes later shot in the other arm. Cleveland then grabbed the bridle of the horse and led Gates to the rear and helped him dismount. Now here is a letter written only 5 days after the battle by Lieutenant James Yerger, who incidentally was not a Missourian. He's a member of the Mississippi Brigade. He said, he described the charge of Cockrell's brigade amid a most deafening roar of artillery. He related that he saw both Cockrell and Gates wounded and wrote this, I shall never forget the steady, calm gaze of that old hero Gates as he sat on his horse erect as a statue, his paralyzed arm hanging by his side. Many of this brigade fell on and in the enemy's works, and some passed over. Well, I'm watching my time, and so I'm not going to read you all the eyewitness reports, which there are many, many, many of, which you will find in the book that I have written. But I want to speed to the end here because I've probably not handled my time very well. One of the men that was shot near the gin house was Captain John Hickey, who said he was shot near the gin house and he couldn't crawl or get away, and when he was laying on the ground he was shot several more times. And the guy actually survived the war, believe it or not. Let's have another picture or two. This, of course, is a famous painting of The Charge by Gall. Let's have another one. This is a picture of Pat Claiborne, I believe, leading his men forward, waving his sword in the vicinity of the cotton gin. Let's have the next one. This is a famous Troiani painting of the breakthrough at the 1st Kentucky Battery, which is right at the Columbia Pike. It's between the Columbia Pike and the cotton gin. Next one. This is a new painting by Rick Breeze called On the Rim of the Volcano. There's a guy trying to jam a log in that cannon mouth. Well, that was a Missouri soldier, and it didn't work because the cannon was already loaded. And he was up there trying to jam that log in there, and they fired the cannon, and you can imagine what happened. He became tomato soup in a very short order. Next picture is, of course, this is a retrench line. Here's a Kentucky battery. The Missourians stood there fighting between the cotton gin and the Carter House in this area right in here. Let's have the next one, man. This is a picture I used on the cover of my book. Actually, I cheated a little bit. This picture is really from Spotsylvania, Virginia, but I thought it represented hand-to-hand combat, so that's why I used it. Next one. All right. That's the man that won the Battle of Franklin. That's Opdyke. No doubt about that. Next one. This is a famous painting of Opdyke's Tigers by Troiani, making their counterattack at the Carter House, which was the deciding thing because the rebels hadn't broken the Yankee line. There wasn't any question about it. and they were about to turn the cannons and fire up and down the inside of the line, but they were repulsed by Opdyke's men, and Opdyke there has shot all his bullets out of his revolver and got his pistol above his head, which is historically accurate. Let's take a look at the next one. This is Captain James Boyce, who, thank goodness, wrote a diary and letters that I relied upon very, very heavily. And some of the things that happened at Franklin. A 17-year William Neese described how his 17-year-old brother scaled the breastworks at Franklin, endeavoring to beat down the assailants, but they laid hold of him and threw him across to their side, and he was taken prisoner. Neese described the struggle across the works. Across the works. We fought with pick, shovel, and musket and saber, trying to dislodge the Federals, even after the blue fads had restored the gap in their line. William P. McGay was a farmer who said that at the first volley of the Federals, his company of 26 men stretched across the pike, but at one volley, 25 of them fell. And only he was left alive, and he laid down with the fallen men, and this is important. And a short time later, he joined other rebel attacks in the vicinity of the pike, and he was hit again and wounded again. Cinnamon is another man, Captain James Cinnamon, a Philadelphia-born carpenter, who said, it seemed to me the air was red and blue flames, wounded and dying men lying about in ghastly piles. And when we reached the works at the old cotton gin, only 2 or 3 of my companions were with me. Well, Wiley's described the fights at the cotton gin. I'm going to read the Boyce's summation. That's why we have Boyce up there. Boyce said that in the 900 yards from the initial deployment to the main line, men started dropping fast from the start. The flag of the 1st and 4th Missouri went down 3 times, and he names Joseph Donovan, John Harris, and Robert Bentley were carrying it. Finally, this Callahan, this Irishman, grabbed it and carried it to the works where it was planted, and he was wounded and captured. And this is what Boyce said: as we passed the outpost line, that's Wagner's line, outpost line, we rushed upon the main works, a frantic, maddened body with an overpowering impulse to reach the enemy and kill, murder, and destroy. On and on we went, right up to the parapet, delivered one smashing volley as Cockrell had directed, and rolled over the works with empty guns. Colonel Garland had been killed, and Boyce, the senior captain, cried out, "Who's going to stay with me?" And then he named Lieutenant Barnett, Dick Salisbury, Robert Bonner, and Denny Callahan stayed, and we went up to the Federal works where we all went down together. And of course, he said our triumph was short-lived, because then he described the counterattack of Opdyke's, and he said the scene inside the fortifications at Corinth was repeated. A solid wall of blue infantry advanced, and it was just too much. And our men came out of the works as quickly as they had gone in, and some of them went back to the outpost line. How do I know that Missourians fought behind the line? All I've told you so far is what Missourians said. But let's see what others had to say. If you will look at Wiley Sword's map number 7 of Opdyke's charge at the, and incidentally, Wiley's maps are terrific maps. If you will look at the 44th Illinois there, on your lower left corner there, you see them advancing towards the retrench line, and they continue to advance, I believe, towards the 1st Kentucky Battery. But anyway, mark the position of that 44th Illinois. You'll also see right astraddle the pike, the 74th and the 88th Illinois. You'll see them there. They're also advancing in the general direction of the Kentucky Battery and the gin. Okay. Colonel John Russell of the 44th Illinois helped restore the front line position between the pike and the cotton gin, and he said that he described terrific fighting, and And he said that his men captured 83 rebels who reported that they were all that was left of 3 regiments. And among the men they captured was Captain G.W. Coble of Company E, 3rd Missouri, which establishes his present sector. The 88th Illinois led the charge of Oxbach's brigade to recapture the retrenched line. And Corporal Peter Wolf of Company A, 88th Illinois, captured a rebel flag inscribed the 1st and 4th Missouri Infantry. So they were there. And then there's Corporal James Merriville of Company C of the 88th Illinois, who captured and brought from the field 2 rebel flags, one a brigade and the other a regimental flag. I imagine one of the flags he brought was that Missouri battle flag that I've shown you on your tables there. It looks like it's a Christian flag, and indeed it is a Christian flag, but it's the Missouri battle flag. And that's probably the one that he captured. This is what Merrifield wrote. He said, after a charge by Cockrell's brigade, I noticed the flag go down, and I picked up the flag and pulled it off the staff and put it in my pocket. A fine-looking officer lying there covered with dead bodies asked me if I could remove them from his leg if he was wounded. And I got his leg free and gave him a drink of water. And he asked me to unbuckle his sword belt, which I did. And just then I saw another Confederate line approaching, and I returned to the works. He took the belt and the sword of Colonel Garland with him and presented those to the Historical Society of St. Louis. And the flag of the 1st Missouri Infantry was destroyed in the fire at Chicago. The 97th Ohio, which was a regiment of Lane's brigade, which fled but then rejoined Oxbach's countercharge, Colonel John Lane said that in front of the 97th Ohio, which was probably on the retrenched line at that time, a rebel regiment planted their works on their colors on our works. First Sergeant Alfred Ramsbottom of Company K captured that flag. It didn't have any numbers on it. They'd been torn away, but it was lettered Missouri Infantry. And it was the flag of the 2nd and 6th Missouri Infantry, which is now on display in the Missouri State Capitol. Next slide, please. Voices, whom I've shown you. That's a color bearer who we referred to color bearer. Next one. The next slide, please. Doesn't want to go? Try doing it on the machine. Press it again. Picture Colonel Cockrell himself. Colonel Cockrell is a 30-year-old Warrensburg lawyer who fought with the... That's it. That's Colonel Cockrell. When he became Brigadier General, he fought with the Missouri State Guard and was made a Brigadier General after Vicksburg for valor. So, let's look at the next picture, please. The next one. This is the map of the final positions. And this, I believe, you'll see, here's Claiborne, and here's French's division. And you see where French's division is. It's straddling the Columbia Turnpike. Let's have another one, please. That, of course, is the McGavock Cemetery, where you will find in the McGavock Cemetery many Missourians. Of the 82 officers, Missouri officers who charged at Franklin, 82 Missouri officers, 19 were killed, 31 wounded, and 13 captured. Of the 614 enlisted men, 79 were killed, 198 wounded, and 79 captured. And the captured, the official records, all these figures I've given you from the ORs, the official records state that the 92 men missing are known to be prisoners of war captured in the enemy's works. The smallest brigade at Franklin lost 2/3 of its strength, or 419 casualties from the 696 who charged. One of the heaviest battle losses of any brigade in either side of any battle of the Civil War. Unfortunately, They didn't leave any reports because they were all shot up and wounded. Taco, too badly wounded, to report. Cox, wounded in both arms. Lieutenant Colonel Carter was wounded leading the 2nd and 6th Missouri. Colonel Hugh Garland was killed leading the 1st and 4th. And Captain Patrick Knipp was killed leading the 3rd and 5th Missouri Infantry. So that's why there aren't too many reports in the official records. And I think I should conclude and ask for questions. I will only tell you that they did fight one more battle. The Missourians did, defending Mobile at Fort Blakely. Nathan Bedford Forrest wanted them to serve with him, mount them and serve as cavalry, but he was outranked by General Maury, who wanted them to defend Mobile. So that was their last battle, was at Blakely. But I really should stop and try to tell you a little bit about the Missourians and establish the fact that through both Confederate and Federal sources, there's no question at all about where they were and what they did. I'll be happy to take your questions. Yeah.
One question on the overall map, the approach to Franklin, map number 6 in the book, if you have it.
Mine? Or Wiley's?
No, in the handout.
Yes, all right. Yeah.
Where is the Missouri Brigade in this?
You see French's division there? See A.P. Stewart's Corps there to the right of railroad?
I see it.
And French is to the extreme left of it.
Right.
And actually, I didn't have time to read you this, but you see the railroad there? Well, I've got in my book, I tell about a guy that tells about them advancing and crossing the railroad, which means that they were heading towards the Cotton Gin and the Gap at the Pike. Okay? Yeah.
Can you briefly tell us what happened after the Battle of Franklin? They didn't go to Nashville.
Yes, they did, and Wiley will tell you about that. But before they went to Nashville, there was an awful lot of wounded men and men that had to be buried. Some of them were buried in a long trench and later reburied in the McGavock Cemetery, which was on the McGavock plantation near where they deployed. But yes, they did go on, and now the Missouri Brigade was too heavily, it had suffered so much, they did march to Franklin, but they were relieved of duty because they weren't a large enough unit to do anything. They were sent elsewhere. Actually, they were sent to another fort guarding a place on the Tennessee River and rejoined the Army of Tennessee after the Battle of Nashville. Yeah.
Could you recap one more time the numbers of the Missouri Brigade when they enlisted, when they re-enlisted?
Well, when they started out,
and after
when they enlisted in Confederate service, that is after they crossed the river with Price, and at that time there was a total of about 6,000 Missourians. Most of them in the Missouri Brigade, some of them in a combined brigade of Missouri and Arkansas soldiers. That's how many there were to begin with. And I think I told you I think there was about 1,630 who joined the Army of Tennessee, and incidentally they fought at New Hope and other places. They joined right after Resaca, and then after Atlanta, they were down to about 1,000, and that's about what they had at Allatoona. But they lost a lot of men at Allatoona. So at Franklin, they only had, I think, 696 men.
I think that's what you said.
I think that's what I said, but it's in my book.
Is there a count after Franklin?
Oh yeah, yes.
How many was left after Franklin?
Well, there wasn't many left. Roughly about 230.
Thank you.
But some of the wounded returned later because by the time they got down to Fort Blakely in Alabama, their strength had come back up to about 400. But there's only about 230 left, and there wasn't any officers above the rank of major. Yeah. Your question?
Yes, sir. You mentioned Guybor's battery. If I'm not mistaken, that was an Irish unit, and that was the battery that the chaplain was one of the most famous
Bannon, Father Bannon.
Right, good old Father John S. Bennett. My favorite company in the 1st Missouri Brigade is Company F of the 5th Missouri Infantry, and you mentioned Captain Kenneth, who was an Irishman. They were all Irishmen from St. Louis. If I'm not mistaken, sir, that was the skirmish line company of the
Yeah,
brigade.
you're not mistaken, they were.
Okay, could you tell us a little bit about what a skirmish line company does and some of the exploits of Company F of the 5th Missouri?
No, I couldn't begin to tell you all the exploits of Company F of the 5th
Well,
Missouri.
just give me one story, because it's an Irish company.
Well, one story would be at Champion Hill, and that was prior to the attack at Champion Hill, their counterattack at Champion Hill. They were at Champion Hill. It was like a figure 7. Stevenson's division was up here, and then down here was Loring's division and Bowen's division. They were facing. Bowen was facing overlooking a creek, and they were the skirmish company. What the skirmish company does is two things. Mostly in defense, what they do is that they're sort of the first line and sort of put up the initial resistance to see just how serious the attack is going to be. Is this a real deal, or is this just a feint? But that's very dangerous duty, and that's what you do as a skirmish company. And in defense, it's the same thing. They sort of feel the enemy and decide whether to resist or come back to the main line. It's a post of honor. That's what you're getting at. And then most of those guys.
That's definitely what I'm getting at.
Well, it's a post of honor. There's no question about that. Yes.
Was there any of Quantrell's or Anderson's people, did they ever wind up in the Missouri?
No, they didn't. Although it is likely that some of the Missourians, some of the Missourians after the Battle of Corinth left and went back across the Mississippi with some members of the Missouri State Guard who did not want to enlist in Confederate service, and also after Vicksburg, some of them went back and crossed the river, went back to Missouri. And if you'd been a rebel soldier and you were in Missouri, you didn't have a lot of choice, man. The choice was you're either going to get wiped out or put in prison or et cetera, or you're going to fight as a guerrilla. And some of them did. There's no question about it. Some of them did. But we don't know which ones.
It actually probably was the other way then. More came out of the division.
Yes. Correct. Yeah.
If I were going to tell someone what I've learned about the Missouri Brigade, what would I say that made them such ferocious fighters?
Well, that's a good question, and I think part of the answer to that question is that they were frontiersmen. I mean, you want to remember something, that in 1860, the frontier was still in Missouri. These guys were rugged physical guys. They were good shots. They were in good health. They were relatively young guys. That's probably, that plus the fact that they really were highly motivated. Other Confederate soldiers heard from their wives and sweethearts and so forth back home in Georgia and Alabama. But back home in Georgia and Alabama, at that point in time anyway, they were safe. Not so for these guys' families back home in Missouri. And letters did reach them from time to time. So I think that was a major factor. We like to say this. We like to say that the war for most of you all started in 1861. Ours started with the state of, BGES. We started 4 years earlier than that.
Would it also be accurate to say that the leadership from that unit was very good in those units?
Mexican War veterans, some West Point graduates, some BMI men, some Kentucky Military Institute guys, and so forth. Yes, it was excellent. It was excellent. But those were rugged kind of guys, and you had to lead by example. And Cockrell did lead by example. Yeah.
I think another thing, just to comment on his question, a lot of the boys that came in from what they call the frontiers really not only were tougher, but they felt like they had something to prove. Like on the counterpart, the Iron Brigade, for instance, they wanted to show the quote-unquote classier Easterners that they were better men than they were.
Right. Right. But their record, as far as I'm concerned, the record of the Missouri Brigade doesn't need any embellishment from me or anybody else. It's in the ORs, it's in the letters, it's in the reminiscences, and it's in that book. And you can read what I have to say and find out how I back it up. And you can make your own judgment. But it was a very, very, very fine unit. And I'm sorry I wasn't better organized.